Well, I am delighted to open what is my sixth roundtable, and again, appreciate your being here. I'm not going to spend much time up here. I want to talk a little bit about the last year, some of the big issues we dealt with last year, some of what I see coming up in the future, but then talk a little bit about the complexities of natural resource management, which is really the theme that we've got today. So, no surprise, we can ask Rob what the big issues were. He listed them out in the newspaper, and I think in virtually every newspaper rendition that I saw, the big issue of 2015 was Mille. Of course, we've got a number of challenges on Mille, and we're going to use Mille as a really good case study of the complexities of managing that lake. I can tell you in my 5 years on the job, we made some of the toughest decisions we had to with closing the lake. And it really was a signal, I think, to many of us that the complexities that we face in managing these natural resources, not just from the biological standpoint, but from the social standpoint, really is something that we want to explore more with you, because that exploration gives us some appreciation for some of the issues that we face. I think in addition to that, we had really at this event and at a predecessor in 2014, the Pheasant Summit. Last year we kind of launched on the pheasant plan. A year ago we launched on the pheasant plan. And we now have a 10-point plan, some of which we've already had some major accomplishments with. And you all recall, you were all as kind of surprised as I was when the governor announced the buffer initiative. A big part of accomplishing the pheasant plan is the buffer initiative. We've also been successful in getting $1.7 million for the walk-in access program, and we've been successful in getting a conservation reserve enhancement program proposal submitted through the Board of Water and Soil Resources that could put 100,000 acres of habitat on the ground. Some really nice accomplishments coming out of the pheasant plan, and we've got more to do on that in the future. Of course, it was really the second year of rebuilding our deer herd. We're at our second conservative season. We've been blessed to have one mild winter, possibly another mild winter coming up. We're hopeful that the conservative actions that we've taken will really get us to a better place next year, and I think the hunters are already seeing some of that. Another big issue was environmental review. And a lot of people don't know what environmental review is in the department. It's really one of the big elements of work that we do, looking at big projects, identifying what the environmental issues might be in those projects, and then using that information when we get into a permitting process. And of course, this year we had some major accomplishments with the completion of the final EIS on the Polymet project, as well as a preliminary or draft EIS on the Fargo-Moorhead diversion. Two really big projects that will have significant impacts in Minnesota, and using that public process in particular to look at what those impacts might be and inform us as we make our decisions in the future. And I think the fifth big project I'd mentioned, a big issue I'd mentioned, is just water. We've had some notice that the groundwater situation is challenging in several parts of the state. We completed 3 groundwater management areas. Of course, we continue to work on AIS, and I met with our aquatic invasive species stakeholders yesterday, and we always are looking forward. I reminded we did have some successes last year, and one big one was many of us have already forgotten about, is the closing of the Upper St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam, permanent barrier to invasive carp. Big issues in 2015. All of those issues are going to be there in 2016 as well, and some of them will really be coming to a peak. But I think the thing that is going to be foremost for all of us, and we'll hear more about it today, is water. I've said in the past that I think this is the decade of water. I think we've seen that already. I think the governor's actions in the last couple of days with respect to clean water and the Clean Water Summit coming up are indicative of the concern that we've got in the state about the state of our water and how do we improve water. So we will continue to be working on that for the next year, for the next several years, and I think that'll be the headlines in the coming year. So to shift gears here a little bit, to get into the plenary, I think the thing that is common in all of these issues is that the complexity that we have in these issues, and it's not necessarily so much the biological. I can tell you if we reduce the number of antlerless permits, we will have more deer next year, and so on and so on. The biology of many of these issues is oftentimes quite simple. It's a sociology around it that is often challenging, and that's something that it seems to me has gotten more and more intense over the years. As our population has grown, as the intensity of land use has grown, the competing demands have grown, we have to more and more sort of broker outcomes with multiple constituencies rather than just sort of take the biological answer. And so as we think about these complexities, I think it's really important for people to realize that at the Department of Natural Resources, just like any state agency, we operate within a framework that's established by statute, by rules, by policies, and that we have a limited opportunity to act by virtue of those constraints. It gives us some tremendous power, but it also gives us some real guidelines. And we stay in our swim lane, or we get sued, or we get the chain yanked by the legislature, and that's appropriate. That's the way government should work. But we operate within this legal framework, and so we can't necessarily do those things that people sometimes want us to do. As managers of your public assets, we expect to be working with you on all of these issues, and we know that when you get two people in a room, you get two opinions. And so the real challenge becomes, how do we work within that framework, work with the desires that you all have to get to the best possible outcome. I will assert, and I hope you all know by virtue of working with people, that we have a highly committed, very professional staff at the Department of Natural Resources. And I think they truly are making the best professional judgments in their field on these issues that we're dealing with. And so I think, it's challenging in government to earn trust. I hope that by virtue of your association with people in these professional positions that you've learned that they are trustworthy people. They may not come to the same conclusion that you do on an issue, and if that's the case, it's often because there are multiple voices that we're listening to. The reality is, on these really complex problems, there rarely are simple answers. The things for which there are simple answers you never hear about. Those are things that are handled quite easily. And so we need to continue to engage with you. We want to continue to engage with you, not just to tell you why we're doing things, but to hear your opinions on why things ought to be the way they are, and more importantly, so that you can hear each other. If I've learned anything in my public engagement exercises, it is that when you get people together talking to each other about the way things are, it often becomes apparent that it's not just the DNR saying you can't do this, we have to do that in fact it's your colleagues and your peers. So I've worked with many of you for 35 years or more, and I hope that in that time we've both established mutual confidence and trust in each other. I want to assure you that I've got great trust and confidence in our staff, and as we make these tough decisions going forward, we're going to be relying on your support, relying on your feedback, relying on your knowledge to make the right decisions. Before I close, I want to recognize a couple of those key professionals. And first off, I want to mention that we have a new Chief of Enforcement, and Rodman Smith. Is Rod here? I didn't see him yet. He's training. We have special training for colonels, and Rod is getting trained in how to be a colonel. But Rod Smith took over for Ken Soring, and I want to acknowledge the great work that Ken Soring provided as the Chief of Enforcement for several years, and give a round of applause to both those folks. And secondly, and quite notably, Ed Bogus. Ed, where are you, Ed? I know you're here. Stand up, Ed. Ed Bogus is retiring within a couple months as the director of the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and Ed has been conservation. You can sit down now. You don't have to stand up the whole time. Has been a conservation professional for more than 3 decades, much of that with the Department of Natural Resources. I have worked for Ed. I can't imagine a worse task than trying to supervise me, but in the last 5 years, Ed has been the division director, has been involved in many of the most controversial issues that you all are aware of, and has handled them masterfully, in my opinion. It's going to be a big loss to the department to have Ed retiring, but I can't think of a better wish I'd have for Ed than to have a long and healthy retirement. So on behalf of everybody here, Ed, our best wishes. So in closing, thank you for being here. Thank you for your ongoing commitment to natural resources. The fact that you're here today demonstrates that you have a higher than typical interest in natural resources and concern and dedication for natural resources. This is like a big family get-together. Some of you I only see once a year. I very much appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, and please do catch me in the hall or somewhere and chat, and let's catch up. but as well spend time with your colleagues, because this is a great gathering of some of the greatest conservationists in the state. We appreciate your being here. Please enjoy yourself, listen to the presentations, offer us your opinions. That's really why we're here, and have a great time at the roundtable. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tom. This morning's first half plenary session has a focus, as I mentioned earlier, complexity. And this is the complexity of natural resource management, particularly illustrated by the situation on Mille Lacs Lake. To start us off with that conversation, we'll hear from Fisheries Chief Don Pereira, then we'll hear from Tony Roach, then we'll hear from Jim Martin. Don, say a few words to start it up.
Okay, so normally when I'm up here, I speak at length, and I have lots of slides, and that's going to be different today. I've got 5 minutes, and I have just like 3 slides. So I'm going to just try to set the table for the 2 speakers that follow me to talk about the theme of complexity. So I think everybody in this room recognizes that the natural world is a complex place, and it's that complexity is with us all the time. As on a technical side, natural resource managers have recognized how complex systems are and the challenges that brings to natural resource management. We also know that the world is not a static place; it is changing. What is happening now is that the rate of change is accelerating. And if there's anything a little bit short-sighted in the second bullet, is that it's not just natural systems that are changing. Human institutions are changing very rapidly as well. That means our stakeholders, the people that we're trying to provide sound natural resources for, they're the way they relate to the natural world, and their attitudes and values and beliefs are also changing too. So it's not just natural systems, but it's human systems also that are changing, and quite rapidly. So when I was doing the science thing and research for about 30 years, complexity was job security for me. It was exciting, and the fact that the world was changing added to that challenge. So from a research perspective or science perspective, complex changing systems are kind of cool. They make life exciting. In my new job, it's now job insecurity for me, because it poses amazing challenges to try to find out, where are we going? What's the future going to look like? And how do we best address systems that are changing? And Mille Lacs is a system that is undergoing amazing change. And we've talked about Mille Lacs now at the past 2 roundtables. I was here 2 years ago, and I presented quite a bit of detail on what we're starting to understand about the changes in Mille Lacs. And then last year we had a report out from Paul Venarelli, who chaired the Blue Ribbon panel, that provided their review of what's happening on Mille Lacs. So this is my one slide that's technical or biological, and this sums up all the changes that are happening on Mille Lacs that we understand. We know that changes in the physical system, particularly temperature, are changing the dynamics of a key forage item. Tullibee cisco. A number of years ago, we thought they were going to wink out. We caught almost none in our assessment nets. The past 3 years, we've had amazing production of young ciscos in the lake, young tullibee, so that's great. But what is the future of a cold water fish like cisco in Mille Lacs 20, 30 years from now? We also know that smallmouth bass are expanding quite dramatically in the lake. That's an animal that likes warmer water. We have managed it as a trophy, but we think that the expansion of smallmouth bass is not because of management. It's simply because the growing season is longer in Mille Lacs. So Mille Lacs is providing a great smallmouth bass fishery right now. One of the biggest changes in Mille Lacs is increased water clarity. And that happened before zebra mussels arrived. And that's not a strange thing. It's happening all around the country, actually. If you want to see some of the most dramatic impacts on water clarity and fishing, look at some of the southeast reservoirs in the United States, where bass fisheries have declined dramatically in productivity. There's been quite a few papers written about that. So it's not increased water clarity, decreased nutrients, lower productivity. It's not new to Mille Lacs. We can see it in other lakes in Minnesota. Very clearly in Minnetonka, we can see it over 30 years, water clarity increasing in Minnetonka, the fish community changing. We have more plants, pike-like plants, we have more pike. And then we have invasive species as well. Zebra mussels arrived in the lake some time ago. There's a lot of them. They look like they've come down. Maybe they've plateaued. We don't know how they're impacting the system yet. We do know that spiny waterflea are dramatically changing the zooplankton community, and we think there's going to be repercussions on the production of small fish, probably forage fish, by spiny waterfleas. But we don't know the details of how that's going to happen. So this system is changing in about every way possible, and we're trying to figure out how to manage it, and we're trying to just get a glimpse of where it's going to land, what the future is going to look like for Mille Lacs. And so what we need to do is to just accept the fact that the system is changing dramatically, and we need to try to help our stakeholders be nimble and help them adapt to a system that's going to be different than it was 20 years ago. That's the reality of what we're up against. So the final point is that change actually increases the level of uncertainty. So it makes it much more challenging to figure out what is the future going to hold for us. So we need to increase our capacity to adapt, and we need to help our stakeholders adapt as well. So with that, those are my opening comments. And Brian, do you want to introduce Tony?
I will do that. Thank you, Don. Round of applause for Don. As we go along here, you may have questions. We'll try to have a little bit of a question and answer session at the end of this morning plenary session, but jot them down so that you can find a chance to ask the questions of the individual speakers throughout the event or at one of the other sessions. It's a pleasure to introduce Tony Roche, our next presenter, who's going to give us a guide's perspective on that changing system. Tony is a well-respected fishing guide, tournament angler, and outdoor communicator. He operates Roche's guide service on Mille Lacs Lake, and he's one of the most successful guides on the Big Lake. His friendly grin and relaxed personality make him an equally successful teacher, speaker, and fishing buddy. Please join me in welcoming Tony Roche to the podium.
Well, thank you, Brian. I want to say that I'm truly grateful for being able to speak here at the Roundtable meeting. For me, I'm not going to sit up here on this podium and say that I have all of life's experiences like a lot of people in this room, but I do spend a lot of time fishing. My wife refers to it as a disease. I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes. She wakes me up and says I've been repeating 19 feet for hours. But because of that, I think it gives me an interesting perspective on fishing, habitat, fisheries, even though I don't claim to be a fisheries manager, biologist, or ecologist. I do spend a lot of time looking. As a child, I grew up on a lake. I spent countless hours swimming out in front of my parents' house, even in rough weather, to figure out why the walleyes would bite off our dock when it's windy versus when it's not. Swimming through sunfish beds to see how they would react to different things as I would place in their bed. So I've always been inquisitive like that, and I think some of the things that I'll talk about as far as it pertaining to Mille Lacs Lake, that's definitely part of my wheelhouse. As far as giving a speech on fisheries management, that may be not so much of my expertise, but I do want to present this to you. And I also want to say I did get some input from people around Mille Lacs Lake, people with brick and mortar businesses on Mille Lacs Lake. Me as a fishing guide, I'm diverse. I spend a lot of time not only fishing walleyes, smallmouth bass. I'm a multi-species angler. I spend a lot of time fishing all over Minnesota. However, some of these people that have a brick and mortar business have been in business for numbers of years and have a lot of knowledge of the lake. And so I wanted to get their perspective as well, so I'll be playing a video in my presentation. So Mille Lacs Lake, complexity seems to be the theme here. Definitely Mille Lacs is one of the largest inland fisheries, contributes 150 to 200 million regionally into the state economy. Mesotrophic, it's 132,000 acres with 70% of spawning habitat. Of course, to make it even more complex, it's in the 1837 ceded territory. Mille, as we know, has a lot of moving parts. You know, you don't get a lake that big and not have a lot of moving parts, you know, from fish to habitat to, you know, the social aspect of Mille. There's lots of moving parts. Technology, not only Mille Lake, but there's a lot of fisheries and in our state and nationwide that are changing just simply based on technology. Technology is rapidly growing just in the last 5 years, let alone the last 10 or 15 years. So, you know, information technology is probably one of the biggest things I notice. Mapping technology, sonar improvements, boat and motor technology. You take a lake the size of Mille Lake, and boat and motor technology make a huge difference. When I can get to the center of the lake within minutes rather than hours. Ice fishing equipment, that's another thing. Ice anglers in general, they're more comfortable. They're spending more money on ice equipment. They're getting to spots quicker. You couple that with information technology, and things are exploding it just from a year-to-year basis. What used to take weeks and months or years to learn, you can learn in a day. I'm teaching anglers all over about different techniques on a daily basis. We live in such an instant world. I want to play a quick video. Again, these are people around Mille Lake that I literally last week drove around, and they were nice enough to take the time to give their input. Like I said, you know, I'm in my 30s, so I don't claim to have all of the world's problems solved, but a lot of these people know their business better than I do, so I wanted them to be able to articulate that.
My whole idea, my whole concept for literally driving around and encompassing the entire lake is to get different perspectives, different views of businesses, just different people around the lake in general, and getting their idea, their perspectives, and really just stopping in at random. Hey Bob, how you doing?
Good, Tony. How are you?
Good, thanks for meeting with me.
You betcha.
Appreciate it.
Well, right now I'm real positive and encouraged by the 2013 and 14 class. This early ice this year, we're seeing customers go out on the mud, and a lot of these smaller fish are being caught from 12 to 16 inches, and that's very, very encouraging. I mean, in some cases, that's all they're catching. They make a few moves, and of course, they're getting into some 20s and 21s and bigger fish, but that's very encouraging to see.
As we turn south on 169 and head towards Garrison, I can't help but notice all the iconic images, things that have really shaped the way people fish on Mille Lake, the way things are done, business is done. Tuts, for example, the Tuts map that came out really changed not only the way we fish on Mille Lake, but how we look at modern day mapping. It was really one of the first realistic GPS maps out there, especially for this body of water.
I don't know, you talk to old timers and stuff about, you know, fishing prior to the map. You know, I mean, there just weren't many people that could do it. You know, it was a very special few, and you know, I think launch business maybe back then was probably bigger, you know, because those guys knew it. You know, they were out there, they could fish those areas where, you know, the regular anglers couldn't. You know, and it has changed the whole thing, the whole game of fishing on Mille. Primarily, I would say this shop was 85% walleye. You know, 10 years ago, you know, 15 years ago, and you could, you know, make a living on that. You know, now if I was 85% walleye, I wouldn't be here anymore. So my business would be gone.
As we pass the frozen walleye, it's great to see a few fish houses in the background. With the closure taking place on August 3rd, it's nice to see business get back to normal with this delayed start to the season.
Overall, you know, the business changed a little bit with the advent of the wheelhouses. So you have a little bit less rental business, but you've got some road passes. But so because I do a lot of rentals, you know, that has had some effect, but it's still been a good business. The key word that's been around is diversification. Well, not everybody can diversify, and to try to bring this area back without the walleye is not going to be a good game plan in the long term. It'd be like trying to bring the Black Hills back if the Mount Rushmore fell off the mountain.
what we see today has been a big shift from that permanent house, or that skid house we like to call them, into wheelhouse and portables being the flip over styles, and into wheelhouses where they can actually follow the bite. So if, I know it's a stretch, but if for some reason Mille Lacs isn't the hot bite, they can take that wheelhouse, hook it behind their truck, and they can haul it to the next best bite, whether that's on Leech, Winnie, Gull Lake maybe. We see a lot of folks head up toward Red Lake and even as far as Lake of the Woods. So the day of our captive market of people coming here, staying for the weekend or staying for the winter, this has all changed now to where we get a lot of day trippers. We get a lot of folks that will come and visit Mille Lacs 1 or 2 weekends a winter, and they take the rest of their recreational time and spend it in other areas, enjoying other areas of the state.
Yeah, we've had to, market different species of fish, the northern, the bass, let out our little hidden secret that we've got a world-class bass fishery. We've got to tell everybody that. And, and we're using different avenues. Of course, social media is really big, so we're trying to spread the word about, those different things there as well. I think the technology has really stepped up the game, more. It used to be before where, you came to the lake and you didn't have all of it. Maybe 1 out of 10 caught fish. Now it's 9 out of 10 are catching fish. I think that's really changed. The smartphones, I have people walk in my office all the time and throw their phone at me and say, here, where do I go? So I think that's changed the dynamics of fishing all the way around. Of course, the boats are bigger and better, and the electronics are bigger and better, so that's all changed through the years. And, that's just changed fishing all around, everywhere.
And it's not just the boats and motors. I mean, it's the beginnings of the Loran, the GPS, the graphs, the side view, the bottom view. I mean, it's just, it opened up opportunities for anglers of little or no knowledge, except for the equipment they were running, to figure out a lake. There's more to a lake than a muskie. There's more to a lake than a bass. There's more to a lake than a walleye. It has to be an ecology that works. And the more we seem to be managing stuff, the more we're messing it up.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for meeting with me.
You bet. Anytime. Anytime.
Again, you can't go drive by Mille Lacs Lake without seeing that McCoyd's name. That's one of the legendary names on Mille Lacs Lake. And of course, Kevin McCoyd is not only an accomplished angler on this lake and a guide on this lake, he's a legendary tournament angler. He's fished a lot of different locations. He knows a lot about not only walleye fishing, but just fishing in general. Mm-hmm. Kevin, I'm doing this presentation for the roundtable meeting. I'm getting perspectives all around the lake. We've really started on the north end and worked our way all around the lake. What are some of the changes you've seen, either historically or just from a fisheries perspective or an angler's perspective, that you could share with us?
There's been a lot of things. I've had the resort here for just about 23 years now. So what I've seen from the resort end of it, we're just getting ready to put all the fish houses on the lake. We've gone from a lot of 8x10, 8x16 size houses 23 years ago to right now. I don't think I have 5 in my whole resort of 200 houses. Everything's gotten bigger. So that's definitely been a big change for me. That especially in this region, a lot of the lakes are just changing. It's with the invasive species, a lot of them are getting cleaned up. So it's, for us, bass just exploded, really in the last 8 years or so. But as far as the walleyes go, I fished Lake Erie, I fished Leech Lake, I fished Lake of the Woods, some of the different river systems down in Mississippi. All of them have their challenges. All of them have different times when they're doing a lot better than others. It's not a straight line. You're going to go out and catch the limit of walleyes in any one of those systems. They have their highs and their lows, and you just kind of flow with it and deal with them.
All right, Kevin, I really appreciate you've had a lot of great insight. I appreciate you meeting with us. I know you're busy. I'll let you get back to pulling houses out in the lake. Thank you very much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tony.
I do want to swing in and talk to George Nitty. George has been in business for over 20 years. George did something last summer after the walleye closure that I thought was unique and a great idea. If you went out as launches, released smallmouth bass, he'd give you 2 packaged commercial walleye fillets, and then in turn, you know, his customers came in, had a fish fry, came into his bar restaurant a lot of times.
I think the concerns for me are the bait fish. We have a creek that runs through our property. Thousands and thousands and thousands of shiners are in there, and you know, they're being taken out before they have a chance to get back into the lake. You know, being in the food business, everybody needs to eat. I believe fish need to eat, and you know, the years that we don't have bait fish, you know, the bite is fantastic. The years that we do have bait fish, the bite is lower. So on that note, you know, we need to take care of those bait fish.
Upon arrival back on the northeast corner of the lake, I first of all wanted to thank all the small business owners for participating in this video. And then I also wanted to showcase the fact that the people around Mille Lacs Lake are just as diverse as the ecology in Mille Lacs Lake. And so getting a sampling and an idea of their thoughts and perspectives, I thought added a lot of value to this video, and hopefully you feel the same way.
A lot of people around the Mille Lacs area are diversifying, and they're smart business people. They're getting it, and they're understanding that we're changing very rapidly as it pertains to fish habitat in Mille Lacs Lake. Just a couple quick, slides as far as walleye abundance. We all know that the walleye numbers have been on the decline. It's a changing system. Don touched on this. I pulled some of the same ideas as far as just the introduction of invasive species, temperatures going up, a growing predator community, obviously zooplankton numbers declining, the water could be a lot clearer, from an angler's perspective. These are all things you notice on a daily basis. Another thing that I feel has been overlooked is the fact that burbot are completely almost vanished from the system, and of course Chinese mystery snails. Data shows that production is good. There's good production of juvenile walleyes in Mille Lacs Lake. Especially over the last, here it shows you over the last 15 years in particular, recruitment or production has been good. However, it seems like after year 2, they've been disappearing. I mean, that's the concern. That has been the concern leading up to 2013. Now, I have some theories on that. Just from spending countless hours on Mille Lacs Lake, why leading up to 2013, especially those 2 or 3 years right before 2013, I have a couple theories on that. So one, yes, we do have a growing predator community, no doubt, and that puts strain on the forage system. However, as far as the walleyes disappearing themselves, who's eating who? These are charts that have come out from the Minnesota DNR, from the Fisheries, that shows just that. Walleyes are eating walleyes. With the lack of forage in the lake, they've got to eat something. Reduction in primary forage. As you can see, there's some charts here showing Cisco numbers, perch numbers. They're all over the charts. I'll agree with that. I think, when you have, different cycles of fish year class, you're going to have cycles of bait fish hatches. But along with that we're not studying our reduction in other forage species, something I think we need to take a look at. White suckers in the lake, spot tail shiners, crayfish numbers. Even crayfish numbers, I have never seen any concrete data, and I'm just curious about it. I think that's something we need to look into. Darter minnows or trout perch. Where do we stand with these types of forage species? I think they're just as equally important as Cisco numbers and perch numbers for sustainability. You saw that big spike in Cisco numbers. I think that bridged the gap in those few years leading up to 2013. We'd be in a worse situation, I feel, if it weren't for that spike in Cisco numbers. But if there's some other forage species out there that we can track and really, take some a good hard look at, I don't think we're going to see these big spikes in other primary forage species. So, in turn, my theory, my hypothesis, the recruitment of walleyes in the few years leading up to 2013 were definitely hampered by the lack of primary forage. Walleyes were eating walleyes. More research has to be done on baitfish dynamics. That's just something I'd like to see moving forward and as an angler. Signs of the storms passing, we're doing a lot of great things. I'm a person that has, my glass is always half full. If you know me, I'm a positive person. I think that we're taking positive steps to, getting over this hump, if you will. Conservative management approach. We've got very low allocation as far as harvest. Preserving remaining spawning walleyes. We're doing a good job in trying to protect that 2013 year class until they become sexually mature. That's going to be very crucial for Mille Lacs Lake, and of course the Mille Lacs Advisory Committee. Just the DNR at working with business owners and people on the committee as far as getting transparent, workable solutions moving forward. Those are all really good things. Economic and environmental improvements, obviously the 2013 year class again. Cisco numbers rebounding. It looks like zebra mussels are a little bit on the decline, of course. Just natural things that are taking over. Increased angling hours on smallmouth bass. That's huge. That's huge for the economy. I think local businesses are really seeing that light, especially with BASS coming. Other signs of storms on the horizon, though, the things I worry about moving forward is we have this great 2013 year class, but I'm really worried about current spawning stock. It's been good up until the last 2 years. It's on the decline the last 2 years. Now, I'm not going to make a snap judgment just based on 2 years, but as an angler, it concerns me. So I'm going to leave it at that. I am a fisherman. Red sky, if you're an angler, you know red sky in the morning. Sailors heed warning. Red sky at night, sailor delight. I can't say I can go either one way on this. I don't know if it's a red sky in the morning. I don't know if it's a red sky at night. My glass is half full. I'm hoping it's red sky at night, and this 2013 year class is going to carry us through. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate you listening, and I look forward to the rest of the meetings.
My name is Bob Elbers. I represent the Minnesota Valley and Fishermen Club, and I have a question for Don regarding Mille Lacs. As we all know, 2013 was a record ice out on Mille Lacs, and as a result, there was virtually no netting during the spawn that year. Is there any correlation between that and the record year class we have with 2013? And if so, we may be trying that again this coming spring with the netting situation. If we do see some correlation between no netting during the spawn and improved walleye classes, is that something we could look at long term?
There's two parts to my answer. One is specifically on Mille Lacs. There is no correlation because we've had, and Tony showed this, we've had a trend in increasing production of young fish over the past 15 years or so. That's kind of independent of physical factors, if you will, such as spring weather events. And the second part is beyond Mille Lacs. If you look into the technical literature on biologists that have studied walleye recruitment, when there's a late ice out, you have higher probability of a large year class. And that relates to other physical things that might happen in conjunction with the late ice out event that potentially increases the survival of very small fry. You have a less probability of cold fronts coming in and causing those fry to grow slower and therefore die at higher rates. So we don't see any line of evidence that the late ice out and lack of band netting was a factor in the 2013 year class.
Thanks, Don. Thanks for the question. Other questions?
For Mr. Landwehr, back to money. For those of us who are kind of gray, we remember when the lottery got passed because the money was going to go to conservation. And we just had the huge settlement and said that the state of Minnesota, I think, was going to get around $55 million. And that what percentage of that truly is going to conservation, where in conservation, and how is it being spent?
Well, that's a great question. Actually, it's a longer story because I think what happened with the original Reinvest in Minnesota program ultimately led to the Legacy Amendment. But back in, I think it was like 1985, 84, something like that, Governor Rudy Perpich convened a blue ribbon panel to look at the future of game and fish, hunting and fishing in Minnesota. Had a report produced. And the outcome of that report was it said it was estimated that the sales tax that were generated from hunting and fishing amounted to $60 million a year. And that therefore, in order to sustain hunting and fishing, the state of Minnesota ought to invest an additional $60 million a year into fishing game, natural resources management. And so out of that discussion, the governor actually started with a $16 million general fund appropriation to the DNR to do things. And it was really a great time at the department at that point in time because we were getting, more people in the field do more work. There's more dollars for, cover plantings and, habitat work. And that was the high water mark. We never hit $16 million again. It went down steadily from that. Now, some elements of the RIM program, Reinvest in Minnesota program, remain today, and they are twofold. One is the RIM Reserve, which is the program in the Board of Water and Soil Resources to conserve habitat largely through easements, and the other is the RIM Critical Habitat Match. So when you see a license plate, a critical habitat plate, $30 from that plate goes into this fund that is then used as match for donations that come into the department. So those two elements of RIM stayed, but the notion that there was going to be this ongoing general fund money never caught hold. What came subsequent to that, and Senator Lessard is here, and maybe some others who were influential in making it happen, is the lottery amendment passed. And the lottery, when it passed, originally was supposed to dedicate 50% of the proceeds into the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and 50% into the Greater Minnesota Corporation. Within a couple of years, the legislature changed it, put 40% in the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, 60% in the general fund, and that's where it sits today. So today, the lottery still funds, the great work that comes out of the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Susan Thornton is here, the executive director of that, and we get a lot of great projects that come out of that money. It is the sort of offspring, if you will, of the Reinvest in Minnesota program. But because of the concern that there was still not enough money, and it was still not going into the comprehensive landscape projects that people felt we needed, ultimately, again, largely through the work of Senator Lessard, the Legacy Amendment ultimately passed through the legislature, was endorsed by Minnesotans some 6 years ago. And as we all know now, that's $100 million a year for habitat work, $100 million a year for clean water work, and $100 million for arts and parks work. So the original idea of dedicating money into reinvestment in Minnesota natural resources has carried through time to now this funding situation we've got today. And so I have to observe, what Jim is seeing nationwide is not what we're seeing in Minnesota. We are very, very fortunate in Minnesota that we still have very strong support for the programs of the Department of Natural Resources. But we also have this other pot of money, which ostensibly isn't coming to the DNR, but is still being done for habitat work across the state. So I just think we're in a very enviable position here, and I think it goes back to, I would say, Governor Perpich's Blue Ribbon panel.
This is for Dr. Martin. Hi, Jim. And about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of alarm raised about lead fishing tackle, and we spent a lot of time focusing on that here in Minnesota. And the tackle companies pretty much said, yeah, we sort of hear you, but we can't gear up. It's going to take us some time, but my opinion is that hasn't been forthcoming too much, and I'm wondering what's going on nationally with this issue, and what is Pure Fishing doing?
What's going on nationally on this issue is the conversation is continuing. A number of environmental advocates building off lead shot in hunting and then lead bullets concerns are continuing to push for banning lead from the environment as a whole. I think that most fishing tackle companies see someday there will probably be a lead ban, not because it's justified in terms of any public health or water pollution perspectives, There's no question that ingested sinkers do kill some loons. There's no question it doesn't have a population level effect. But sooner or later, we're probably going to see environmental legislation across this country banning lead. I think most companies do not believe that it's justified in terms of the actual impacts on wildlife or any public health demonstration or any water pollution demonstration. It's just kind of a feeling that people have over a long period of time that we're going to end up banning lead. And so I think most companies are already starting with their Plan B economic analysis of what they're going to do. They already have to do that in the Northeast because state fish and wildlife agencies and legislatures have already banned a lot of lead in New England states. We're seeing proposals in California. We've seen lead bans in national parks. We've seen kind of a piecemeal approach to it. Our company basically made a strategic investment in an lead alternative product a number of years ago and are continuing to try to figure out where the market's going. I think the industry as a whole is fighting for a fair decision based on actual facts and not just innuendo, but also sees the long-term trend moving in that direction.
I'm very, very glad to be here. Delighted to see such a tremendous turnout as I would expect, given the importance of all these issues to all of you and to all of Minnesota. I want to start by really commending and thanking Commissioner Landwehr. He's got the toughest job in state government. There are a whole lot more Minnesotans who care a whole lot more about who's the commissioner of DNR than who's governor of Minnesota, and for good reason, because natural resources are a big part of why we're all Minnesotans, why we choose to live here, why we want to raise our families here and pass on the legacy of these resources to our children and grandchildren and generations to follow. And so I thank you, Commissioner Landwehr. You've done an outstanding job. The thing is about Tom, he loves to do all these things. What a job when for the weekend he's off hunting, fishing, camping. He and his family live this life, and so he not only does he have all the technical expertise and experience, but he really cares. And the other reason he's in high favor with me is I caught 9 fish at the Governor's Fishing Opener on Lake Vermilion. But you may know my family has a cabin in Lake Vermilion. My father took me out fishing for all the years growing up, and I didn't know that he didn't know how to catch fish. So I spent many hours on Lake Vermilion, many hours on Lake Vermilion, not catching fish. So this was a revelation to me that there actually are multiple fish in the lake, and I thank you for that, Commissioner. Also, I thank you for taking on the critical situation in Lake Mille. That was something that you spent a lot of time and attention. I have too. I'm really delighted. I don't know what the session this morning covered, but really delighted that you're going to go with an aggressive restocking effort this spring. And as Franklin Roosevelt told his cabinet when he took office at the beginning of the Great Depression, try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. But for God's sake, try something. And I'm determined in Mille and some of these other issues that we need to take on aggressively, we're going to try it. We're not going to be wasteful about resources or strategies, but we're going to try something, and then if that doesn't work effectively, we'll try something else. But we're going to face these issues head on, and we're not going to let them fester, and we're not going to have any Flint, Michigans in Minnesota. I want to thank the legislators who are here. Their leadership is crucial. They spend a great deal of their time and extra time at sessions like this and in their districts. And, quality natural resources, protecting them and preserving them, enhancing them is not a political issue. It's not a partisan issue. It's a Minnesota issue. And I'm just glad that we can have that chance to work together and look forward to continuing to do so. You may have heard I came out this morning with a bonding bill, $1.4 billion. We had over $3.7 billion of requests from all over the state. I'd say over 90% of those were good projects, much needed projects. And so my bill funds 37%, just a little over a third of those projects, in areas that are so crucial to Minnesota. The bonding bill is an investment in the future of our state. Some people say, well, we can't afford to spend $1.4 billion. I say we can't afford to spend less than that, especially when we're in a sound financial condition. When we have a low bonded indebtedness, we rank 34th lowest among the states, and 34th from the worst. So, in the good category. And you look at the projects that I had to turn down, you'll see why everything I proposed. Obviously, the legislature will have its own views of it, but the overall effort that makes, especially in areas like higher education, if we want to have a world-class education system, and we want to turn on our young people and middle-aged people going back for re-education, prepared for the jobs of the future, the jobs that businesses in their communities are offering, then we need to have state-of-the-art facilities as well. And the natural resource component, yesterday I stressed the water quality. $219.7 million of that $1.4 billion would go to water quality, water improvement projects. $30 million for Reinvest in Minnesota, RIM. That would be part of a 5-year, $150 million state initiative as it's envisioned, which would leverage some $650 million in federal funding, so it would be an $800 million initiative over those next 5 years. Again, just critical. As I learned with the Pheasant Summit, and those of you who brought my attention to that critical need, I thank you for that. Sort of was my incubation into some of these bit broader issues. But when you look at the need for habitat, it's all interrelated. Wildlife habitat is related to water quality, which is related to the availability of hunting and fishing opportunities for everybody. It's all part of one giant ecosystem, and we're responsible for it. And that's what we need to impress upon our fellow Minnesotans. These are problems. They're solvable problems. They're not problems to point the finger at this group or this section or that section. They're all Minnesota's problems. They're all of our challenges, and they're all of our responsibilities. And water quality is key to that. We're the land of sky blue waters. I remember that commercial drilled into me growing up, and we can't take that for granted. The facts are that all the uses and all the business industry, farming, recreation, everything else that all of us do, 5.5 million people, has put enormous pressure on our ecosystems, and including quality water. And the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's report last spring, which some people deny and some people want to ignore, but it's frightening. It's frightening areas, especially in western, southwestern, and southern Minnesota, where not only the runoff into the lakes and rivers and streams, which we started to face up to in the last legislative session and will need to continue, but also the leaching of fertilizer and other into the groundwater, business practices. Again, I'm not trying to single out any industry or any group. I'm just saying it's a challenge and a responsibility for all of us. But when people in towns like Adrian have to be delivered bottled water because the water that's coming out of their tap is unsafe to drink because the water treatment facility is broken down, and when there are other small communities throughout, especially greater Minnesota, who can't afford the cost of these water treatment operations, which is why we're not going to just keep pounding on the table, the buffer bully that I am. We're going to help people. We're going to provide the resources, the wherewithal, hopefully at the state level, expanded resources for particularly smaller communities in greater Minnesota to undertake these necessary improvements. But it's not just greater Minnesota, it's not greater Minnesota alone. It's the metro area. Hastings is being impacted by groundwater contamination. And of course, we got White Bear Lake and the drop off there, and the contrast between the phosphorus levels of the resource of the water there and then phosphorus level of other available water resources. As you know, these are complex issues. But they're not only ones that are going to get worse if we don't face up to them. And I'm determined for the remainder of my term, which is 3 more years, and the good Lord willing, you're stuck with me for those 3 years, that I'm going to do everything I possibly can to not only do what we need to do for Minnesota today, but to do what we need to do to improve this state for the future. And that means investing in our infrastructure, that means investing in our transportation systems, and it means investing in our natural resources. And I ask for your support of that. I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe in that, along with me. But everything you can do to press those respective cases in the legislative session. We'd be very, very grateful for your support because it won't happen without all of you and your organizations. Also, just make note of, if you hadn't already, we have a Governor's Water Quality Summit on February 27th at the Intercontinental Hotel in St. Paul. Registration, the link is available on the Governor's website, where we're thinking we may have as many as 1,000 people there. And we're asking registrants to, as well as anybody else who has an interest, to list we have a list of priority issue areas, to list the top 5 to help us really focus in, because we'll spend a whole day. But it's as you know, a multifaceted and wide-ranging subject. But the response already shows a tremendous amount of interest, and that's a good place to start. Make people aware, and a lot of people in Minnesota haven't been made aware of just the challenges we do face and what we must do, so that they can turn on their tap water and know that it's safe, and their kids, and they can go play in the neighborhood pond or stream or walk in it, and they can do so safely. And that's all of our responsibility. One other particular item I want to focus on in this legislative session, I proposed it last year, and so I sort of thought it was pretty automatically gather pretty broad support, but it didn't quite happen that way. So we're going to go back, and I'll try to do a better job of persuading legislators about dealing with the poaching. And we're talking not about people who, maybe missed page 367, Appendix D of the DNR manual for whatever the regulations. We're not talking about people like that. We're talking about people who are committing criminal acts. And they're really criminal acts against all of us. People who are poaching and turning, killing the numbers of deer and turtles and fish, and then get caught and get away with a slap on the little finger. I heard a story of one guy who was one of the really extreme deer poachers up in northwestern Minnesota, and he went to court and got a non-existent sentence, and that night he was at the local bar bragging about what he'd done and bragging about how he got away with it. Well, that's just fundamentally wrong, and that should be offensive to every regulation-abiding, conservation and resource-loving Minnesotan, which is 99.9% of our population. And we're the ones who are harmed when this goes on. So I'm glad to be here today with Dennis McAdance of Turn-In Poachers. We're going to have a brief news conference after my remarks here. But I really encourage the legislature to take a careful look at these proposals. You might want to adjust the numbers and the penalties. But if people are going to just commit these kind of really serious criminal acts, and they've got to be treated as such, the really extreme cases have got to be treated as serious criminal offenses. And as I say, they're offenses against the wildlife and our resource, but they're really offenses to all of us and everything we treasure about the state, and the resources and the wildlife and the water quality and the air quality and the ecology, all of it bound together. Here we are, 5.5 million of us inherited this from our parents and grandparents and those that preceded us. And for this brief period of our lifespans, we're responsible. All of us are responsible for the quality, the availability, the affordability. And that means we need to make decisions not just for this year or the next election or even the balance sheet for the year after. We need to be making decisions, and that's what the bonding bill is about, for the next 10 years, the next 20 years. That's where we invest in Minnesota and some of those initiatives. So I know you're already on wavelength with me about this. We're looking into the future. We're looking at not just what the state's going to be next spring, but what it's going to be 10 and 20 springs from now. And whether the people that follow us, our own children, grandchildren, and those who come from all over are going to continue to be drawn to Minnesota because of what we offer, because of what we have, and because of what all of us have preserved and enhanced. And I thank you for your partnership in that. And I want you to know you'll have my full support as well. Thank you.
We thought it was important to have a moment to talk about the progress that's been made on the buffer initiative and the DNR's responsibility for creating the buffer maps. So Sarah Strommen, Assistant Commissioner, is going to come up and give us a few words about the progress we've been making. Join me in welcoming Sarah Strommen.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and as Brian said, it was 1 year ago at this very event that Governor Dayton announced his buffer initiative. And this came after discussion at the Pheasant Summit had daylighted a public concern over the effectiveness of Minnesota's buffer regulations. In the discussion that followed the summit, specific concerns raised were that 1, not enough waters were covered by the existing regulations. 2, that the mix of law and rule was complex and difficult to understand where requirements applied. And finally, that enforcement mechanisms were ineffective. And so the governor proposed the establishment of 50-foot buffers on all Minnesota waters and urged the legislature to act. And as we all know, proposals that go into the legislative process often come out looking very different. And that's as it should be. As we've talked about today, the theme of complexity is common to all of these issues that we work on. And while the idea of 50-foot buffers on all waters may sound very simple, the reality is that this is no exception to the rule of complexity, and that this is an issue that has a lot of history and has a lot of complexity when you get into how it applies to specific lands, the interaction of the land and water across a landscape that is diverse as the state of Minnesota's. I also want to acknowledge that while we may not all agree on the process for implementation that is now underway, I want to acknowledge the work of our colleagues at Bowser, PCA, Department of Ag, Representative Torkelson, Representative McNamara, Senator Marty, and many of you in this room for the extraordinary efforts to reach a compromise that makes Minnesota's approach to buffers one of the most innovative in the country. And I want to share a few of the ways that our buffer initiative enhances the protection of Minnesota's waters by building on those previous regulations, but offering something new. First of all, the new initiative expands the scope of waters covered. So previous regulations required 50-foot buffers on public waters and 16.5-foot buffers on only about 20% of public ditches. The new law enhances the public waters requirement by putting it into state statute versus a state rule that is only implemented via county ordinance. It also extends the 16.5-foot requirement to ditches within a benefited area of a public drainage system. And finally, it provides a process by which soil and water conservation districts set local standards on other waters not covered under those other 2 categories through local water plan amendments that are approved by Bowser. Second, the new law provides flexibility for landowners. Previous requirements directed the establishment of buffers as the only practice available to landowners. The new law allows landowners to implement alternative practices where buffers are not the best option, as long as those practices afford the same water quality protection as the buffers. Third, the new law sets timelines for implementation. The previous requirements had no specific timelines for implementation or establishment of buffers. The new law establishes timelines for public waters as November 1st, 2017, on public drainage systems November 1st, 2018, and for the local requirement, soil and water conservation districts have to set those standards by July 1st of 2017 with implementation to follow later. Fourth, the new law provides for enforcement. Previous state and local enforcement mechanisms were inadequate and inefficient because they relied primarily on action of county attorneys. And as you can imagine, county attorneys have to deal with a number of issues, most of which are more pressing than buffer infractions. And so the new law creates an administrative fine that can be used by counties, watershed districts, or Bowser. Last, and maybe most importantly, the new initiative appropriated funding. The Clean Water Fund portion of the legacy bill appropriates $5.65 million for program implementation. That's funding that goes to DNR to complete buffer mapping and to Bowser to pass through to local soil and water conservation districts for their implementation efforts. Furthermore, recognizing the key role that soil and water conservation districts play in local conservation efforts, the legislature also appropriated $22 million from the Clean Water Fund for soil and water conservation district capacity, and this is very noteworthy. The initiative also set out roles for implementation. So, different from the governor's original proposal, DNR's sole role is to develop and maintain a buffer protection map. This map outlines where the buffer requirements apply. Bowser then provides administrative enforcement and oversight of the implementation, but the primary role for implementation of the buffer initiative is left to local units of government, soil and water conservation districts, counties, and watershed districts. The DNR mapping process is now underway. That's the first step of the implementation. And it's a process that pairs consistency of DNR statewide data with the uniqueness of local data and on-the-ground knowledge. It's also a phased process in which we intend to have a draft map available later this winter and a final map in July. The buffer map has been recognized as a key component of this initiative because it provides a single source of information that a landowner can access in order to discern whether or not the buffer requirement applies to them. But I want to note that the map, I think, has benefits far beyond just this buffer initiative. This really is the first time where all of this water data, the DNR public water data, all of our ditch data that is now housed independently in drainage authorities across the state comes together in a single place. And I think that this information will have benefits for our water management far into the future. I think also I want to note, as the mapping and implementation phases move forward, I think it's important we remember the purpose, and the governor talked about this purpose in his remarks. The statute outlines the purpose of the buffer initiative as follows. It is the policy of the state to establish riparian buffers and water quality practices to, 1, protect state water resources from erosion and runoff pollution, 2, to stabilize soils, shores, and banks, and 3, protect or provide riparian corridors. I want to emphasize that when we may not have universal agreement on the approach, there has never been any disagreement that water is tremendously important to our state and that protecting its quality is something worth doing. And it's this purpose that ultimately is guiding how we approach implementation. I know that folks have a lot of questions about the mapping effort and about the implementation, and so I'd like to invite you to hear more about the mapping effort specifically and ask those questions. This afternoon, Dave Luthi and Tim Lesh are going to present more details about that mapping effort during the Ecological and Water Resources Roundtable at 3 p.m. Thank you very much.